Welcome back to another deep dive on The Explainer. Today, we're doing something I absolutely love doing. We're popping the hood. Specifically, we're popping the hood on corporate sustainability claims in the meat, poultry, and dairy industry. If you want to know how the biggest food producers on the planet are actually tracking their climate impact, the real math behind the scenes, well, you're in the exact right place.
You know the feeling, right? You're walking down the grocery aisle and you see labels claiming a product is eco-friendly, sustainable, or working toward net zero. It can be incredibly frustrating trying to sift through all these vague greenwashing buzzwords. Which brings us to the central question of today's explainer. How is going green quantitatively measured? Like, how do we calculate a massive food company's actual carbon footprint without all the PR and marketing spin?
Okay, let's dive into this. Enter the SASB standards. These are pretty much the gold standard for answering that exact question. Now, under the stewardship of the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, you can think of this document as the rigorous, authoritative rulebook that literally forces companies to show their math. It outlines the precise sustainability metrics that are reasonably expected to affect a company's financial condition and operating performance. Here is our roadmap for making sense of this dense accounting protocol. We'll be looking at 1. The corporate climate ledger. 2. Defining Scope 1 emissions. 3. Tracking reduction targets. 4. The energy management equation. And finally, 5. The power of standardized data.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, the corporate climate ledger.
This right here is exactly what the disclosure matrix looks like for a meat, poultry, or dairy company. Notice how there is absolutely zero room for vague adjectives here. Under greenhouse gas emissions, they have to report a quantitative metric, code FBMP110A1, which is their gross global Scope 1 emissions, and that's measured strictly in metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Similarly, for energy management, they've got to report their total energy consumed in gigajoules, breaking down the exact percentage of grid electricity versus renewable energy. This table? This is the foundational math of corporate sustainability.
Moving right along to Section 2, defining Scope 1 emissions.
So what actually are Scope 1 emissions? By definition, they are the direct greenhouse gas emissions released into the atmosphere from sources that are owned or controlled by the company itself. The SASB standards require these to be calculated according to the methodology of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Now let's ground this in the physical reality of the meat and dairy industry for a second. The vast majority of these direct emissions don't just come from factory smokestacks, they stem directly from the animals themselves. We're talking about the release of methane during enteric fermentation, yes, that literally means cow burps, which surprisingly account for a massive chunk of global emissions, alongside huge amounts of emissions coming from manure storage and processing.
And this is where the math gets super specific. Companies can't just vaguely report their carbon. Actually, scratch that. They're not really just reporting carbon at all. Under these guidelines, they must report the gross global emissions of the 7 specific greenhouse gases covered under the Kyoto Protocol. That includes carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and various fluorocarbons. Because gases like methane and nitrous oxide trap vastly more heat than CO2, companies are required to consolidate all of these into a single metric, metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, or CO2e. They do this using published 100-year global warming potential values. It's basically a genius way to put all these different, incredibly potent gases onto a single level playing field.
Which brings us to Section 3, tracking reduction targets.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it exposes a massive loophole. When a company discusses its strategy to manage emissions, they obviously have to state their targets. But here is a crucial piece of carbon accounting. Is their target absolute, or is it intensity-based? An absolute target measures the total overall reduction in emissions, regardless of whether the company grows or shrinks. An intensity-based target, however, measures reduction relative to a specific metric denominator. For example, reducing emissions per single ton of beef produced. So think about it. If a company uses an intensity target, they could theoretically double their overall emissions if they triple their production, all while still happily claiming they met their efficiency target. That's exactly why the SASB standards force companies to clearly disclose which one they're actually using.
Furthermore, they have to reveal their exact timeline mechanics. This stops companies from manipulating their progress by just picking a convenient starting line. The framework requires them to declare a base year, the specific first year that emissions are evaluated against. Then, they must disclose the start year, which is when the actual reduction activities began, and finally the target year, which is the ultimate deadline for their pledge. If they ever go back and retroactively recalculate or reset that base year, they have to explicitly disclose that too. Basically, no moving the goalposts in the dark.
Let's move into Section 4, the energy management equation. This is the energy equation companies must report. They have to disclose the total aggregate energy they consumed in gigajoules, but they also have to break that massive number down. What percentage came from the electrical grid? What percentage was renewable energy? And what was direct fuel usage? Remember, for the meat, poultry, and dairy industry, purchased electricity and fossil fuels are massive operating costs. They directly influence a company's bottom line and their exposure to future regulatory risks as governments inevitably start taxing or capping emissions.
And hey, if a company wants to boast about using renewable energy, they have to meet a very strict definition. The standard defines renewable energy as coming from sources replenished at a rate greater than or equal to their depletion, things like geothermal, wind, solar, hydro, and specific third-party certified biomass. But here is the real kicker. If a company generates solar power on-site or buys green power, they must legally retain and retire the specific renewable energy certificates or RECs. They absolutely cannot sell those certificates to someone else and still claim they use the renewable energy themselves. No double-dipping allowed.
So, the crucial point is this: the financial control approach. The SASB standards mandate that all this greenhouse gas data must be consolidated and disclosed according to the exact same approach the entity uses to consolidate its financial reporting data. Let that sink in. Environmental data is no longer just a separate fuzzy PR exercise. It is treated with the exact same rigor, the same rigid boundaries, and the same absolute seriousness as a company's financial balance sheet.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, the power of standardized data.
So why go through all this incredibly dense accounting? Why track every single gigajoule and every metric ton of methane? Because standardizing these specific metrics is literally the only way to track actual progress against climate change in the food sector. For the companies, it mitigates the massive risks of sudden regulatory compliance costs and helps them navigate incredibly volatile energy markets. For the broader industry, it standardizes the metrics so that investors, regulators, and everyday consumers can finally compare apples to apples. Because when everyone is forced to use the exact same math, the truth becomes undeniable.
Which leaves us with this final thought. The days of just taking a company's word that they're going green are officially over. We have the frameworks, we have the standards, and we have the math. So the next time you see a flashy corporate sustainability pledge from a major food producer, look past that nice green packaging and ask yourself, where's the math? Are they reporting their absolute Scope 1 emissions, or are they hiding behind a tricky intensity target? Demand the data. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.